recording. Okay, there is a controversy surrounding when the Feast of First Fruits is to be celebrated and when to start counting the Omer to get to Shavuot. Everyone agrees that the Feast of First Fruits is the day that you start counting the Omer, but which one is it? Which day is Feast of First Fruits? Passover is a day for no work, so it is considered a Shabbat. So that's where the controversy is going to come. If you look at Leviticus 23:7, it says, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay? The Torah does not call it a Shabbat. They call it a day you do no customary work. It's the same thing that they do at Yom Kippur. They don't call Yom Kippur Shabbat. They say it's a day where you don't do any customary work. But what's happened is both the Christian church, well, not the Christian church says that's Shabbat, but it doesn't say Shabbat in the Bible. Okay. The Jewish community says, well, it's the day after Passover because it's a Shabbat. So this is where it's going to get a little bit confusing. Leviticus 23:11 says, he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted on your behalf on the day after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it. So the day after Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that first day, you don't do any work. But in the Feast of First Fruits, it's the day after the Sabbath. Does everybody see the problem here? You have 2 Sabbath days in 1 week. You have a day after Passover, which is considered a day of no work, and you have the 7th day, which is the Sabbath day. So,
Miss Sue, I just on Passover itself, is that just an evening or is it an entire day? Like when does that start? Like, or is this just a few hours?
so Passover is
Sunset?
just a meal. The Passover is
Okay.
just a meal. And it's the meal that basically talks about the night that the Jews left Egypt. Okay. So like we talked about a couple weeks ago, there were probably 2 nights of the meal. Okay. And the second night was considered the last night and the start of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay. So that was considered a day of no work, do no customary work. So let's say that Passover was Tuesday night. So Tuesday night to Wednesday night, you didn't do any work. Does that make sense?
Yes.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the Sabbath. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to say.
So on that Wednesday night is unleavened bread. That's when it starts. The feast of unleavened, right after Passover. That's when it starts, the unleavened bread. That Wednesday night, given your example.
No.
No. Oh.
No. So the night of Passover is the first night of unleavened bread. But you can have a Passover meal the night before if you want. Remember, they had to do 2 nights because there's too much. They had to kill a lot of these lambs, and so they made it 2 nights. So there's always 2 nights of the Passover meal. But the night.
I think he's asking because I think in this Leviticus it says Nisan 14 is Passover and then Nisan 15 is the unleavened bread, the first day of unleavened bread.
Okay, so you can have the Passover meal both nights, is what I'm saying.
But is it night the beginning of a day?
That's why
yes.
I get confused when it starts.
Yes.
And the Jews to the Hebrews, they don't wake up in the morning and call that a day. Their days start in the evening. It goes from evening to evening.
Right. So that's why it's a little bit confusing because they can do the Passover 2 nights. They can do the Passover on the 14th They can do it on the 15th. Then they start the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th, the 4th, that evening.
So simultaneously then.
Yes.
Let's
yes.
say if it was simultaneously, okay.
Yes. And here again, that's why the whole thing has basically been called Passover. Because, well, first of all, it's easier to say Passover than, oh, this is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread doesn't really sound that interesting or cool. Passover, just the whole week has kind of been called Passover.
And that's 7 days, right, of unleavened bread?
Yes, 7 days. Mm-hmm. So, so on the 14th, they actually ate unleavened bread. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread was not considered starting until the next. It's very confusing. I wish it was simpler. Honestly, I wish it was, but it's not. And that's why a lot of this confusion. So anyway, no matter when Passover starts, whether it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, okay, that evening of the next day, whatever you want to consider it, the evening of that day was the start of no work. Okay, that day they didn't have any work. So when Jesus was crucified, it didn't matter what day of the week he was crucified. We're going to just, right now, we're just going to say, okay, it didn't matter what day. He had to be put in the ground that night because the next day was considered a day of no work. It wasn't necessarily the next day was Shabbat or the 7th day. It's just a day of no work. Now, when you get to the Feast of First Fruits, it does use the word Sabbath day, Shabbat. So this one here, Leviticus 7, just says don't do any work. This one on the 11th, it says this is the day after the Sabbath day. So it's saying the day after the 7th day, which would be the first day of the week, right? All right, we're going to keep going. Maybe it'll sink in, but this is the problem. The Jews start Feast of First Fruits on the first day of unleavened bread. Okay? They start the next day.
Wait, what do they start on the first day of unleavened bread?
They say it's Feast of First Fruits.
Okay. Ours is Sunday.
Yeah, we do it on Sunday.
Okay, but they do it
because here it says it's the day after the Sabbath day. So we say, okay, the Sabbath day is the 7th day. So the Feast of First Fruits should always be on a Sunday. And of course, we know that when Jesus was crucified, the Feast of First Fruits was on a Sunday. Okay. But the problem comes as to when was Passover, because the day after Passover is no work. But the Catholic Church says, well, Passover was on Friday because the next day was Shabbat. But it wasn't necessarily Shabbat. It was just a day of no work. So we're going to look at a little bit more here.
I've got a question with regards to the word customary. What makes work customary, and what makes work special?
Customary work is things like buying and selling. Like if you're owner of a shop, you shouldn't sell things, you shouldn't go buy things, you shouldn't go and plow your land with, it doesn't need to be plowed. You can, you don't have to plow it that day. Anything that you have to feed your animals. So they fed their animals every day. That's not, I don't know. There were things that they allowed for them to do because they had to do it. So, but if it didn't have to be done that day, or you could, like a woman, she could fix meals for 2 days. She would fix the meal on 2 days meal on Friday, so she didn't have to work on. I don't know. Women still had to get the food out, and they still had to,
Let's say if you're a farmer, each day you need to feed your flock, and And would that be customary or special?
I don't know. I would imagine they probably just put out 2 days work for the animals. I don't know. I have no idea what exactly they did.
Yeah.
Kind of
Right.
That's
like when God told the Hebrews on Friday to get double portion of manna for Shabbat because they weren't supposed to go out and because it's like how Johnny explained it to me, like when you're stopping from the world is like an act of trusting in God and you're not producing. But like you said, if you have to feed your animal, then God's not telling you to starve them.
Right. All right. So on the 5th, Leviticus 15, it says, and you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath day. So this is actually the 7th day. In my opinion, this is my opinion. It's not the opinion of Jewish rabbis and stuff now, because they always start the counting of the Omer the day after Passover. So I don't know how they do it because this actually says Shabbat. But they consider this no customary work Shabbat. Does that make sense? It took me a long time to figure it out. All right, so let's look at Jesus, okay? The day of Jesus. All right, okay, so here's Passover. Passover, the next day, do no work. It is not called Shabbat. It's just a day you don't do any work. Okay, we all believe that's when Christ died. There's no controversy there, right? Now, if this is actually the Sabbath day, so Friday night, okay, if this is actually Friday night, then the next day would have to be Feast of First Fruits, and this is what the Catholic Church believes. This is what the Catholic Church teaches. But did Christ rise from the grave the very next day? He died Friday night. He rose on Saturday night, the next day. And the way they count it is they say, well, okay, we're going to consider Friday a day. And then you got Friday night, that's a night. And then you got Saturday, sort of night, that's 2 nights. And then we're going to count Sunday. So they counted 3 days and 2 nights. But the Bible says, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So even though Christ died on Passover, and the next day was a day of no customary work, it didn't necessarily have to be the 7th day or Shabbat. Does that make sense? It was just a day of no work. So if we go 3 days, then Christ rose from the grave, and the next day was the first day of the week. And Matthew 28 says, now the Sabbath, as the first day of the week, was about to begin. Mary Magdalene and the others, Mary came to see the tomb. So right there, Saturday night, the Sabbath was about, the first day of the week was about to begin. So now you have 3 days. Now you can count backwards. Some people say, well, he may have died on a Wednesday. So what would have happened is he died on Wednesday night. Then he rose on basically Saturday night, or early the next day, which we're going to see here. This is what I spent most of the day working on today. Because the next day was no work, and we're going to look at this, okay? So this was Feast of First Fruits. So that's the problem that we're dealing with today. This would have been the Sabbath day, and then some people believe this was Wednesday, could have actually maybe been Thursday, Wednesday, Thursday, somewhere in there. But definitely it wouldn't have been Friday, in my opinion. But all right, so I kind of went and looked at scriptures to see how would all of this worked out. So I looked at Mark 15:46. It says, Joseph of Arimathea bought a long sheet of linen cloth. Then he took Jesus' body down from the cross, wrapped it in the cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been carved out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone in front of the entrance. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the brother of Joseph, saw Jesus' body was where it had been laid. So Jesus died and they put him in a tomb, and Mary Magdalene and Mary saw where the tomb was. So let's say that was the first day of unleavened bread, right? And the day of rest. The next day was the day of rest. So they couldn't do anything the next day. They couldn't do anything at all. They couldn't buy, they couldn't sell. They had to rest. Now, Luke says basically the same thing, Luke 23:53. Then he took the body down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. The women who had come with Jesus from the Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. So they found out where it was so they could go later and anoint the body. Then they went home, and it says then they went home. Well, did they go to the Galilee? It was probably a day's walk. I don't know if they walked, but it says that they rested in obedience to the commandment. So I'm not sure they could have walked the next day, because so this to me was a little bit confusing. And they could not have prepared spices and perfumes the next day. So the next day after Jesus died was a day of rest. They wouldn't have prepared the spices that day, and they probably wouldn't have walked to the Galilee, but maybe they did. I don't know. So they could not purchase the spices on the day of rest, and the shops didn't open until daylight. Therefore, there had to be at least a day between the day of rest and going to the tomb. So if we go back here, if he died here and this was a day of rest, there had to have been a day here after the day of rest where the women could buy the spices and prepare them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There had to have been a day.
I think Joseph of Arimathea brought the spices. He brought like 100 pounds of spices.
Right, but those spices were just to keep the body from smelling.
Oh.
See, because the women had to go home and prepare the spices and perfume. I'm not sure. When I read the scriptures, it's only one place it said he actually put the spices on the body. All the other places doesn't say that, but they would have had to put some of them on there, or else the body would have smelled by 3 days, because they waited 3 days before they declared them dead. Because back then they didn't know if somebody was in a coma, or they had to wait 3 days before they can verify they were dead. Matthew 27 says, when it was evening, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He took the body, wrapped it in a long sheet and a clean linen cloth. The next day, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate. So this was the day after the day of rest. They would not have gathered during the day of rest. So here again, you have a day between the day of rest and the women going to the tomb. So there had to be a day in between. We're taught that Jesus died on Friday and that he rose on Sunday, but then there wouldn't have been a day of the Pharisees gathering before Pilate. There wouldn't have been a day where the women could actually go and buy those spices. Or maybe you're right, maybe those were the spices that Joseph had and they gave it to him and they just had to prepare it. I don't know. Then they said, sir, we remember that what that deceiver once said while he was still alive, after 3 days I will rise from the dead. So we request that you seal the tomb until the third day. This will prevent his disciples from coming and stealing his body and telling everyone he was raised from the dead. If that happens, we'll be worse off than we were at first. So here it says the third day. So why the third day? Because like I said, no one was considered dead until after the third day. because they could have been in a coma. They could, and that's why Jesus waited with Lazarus. He waited 3 days because he wanted to make sure everyone knew Lazarus was dead. Okay, if he had been raised before that, they could have said, well, he was just asleep or in a coma. They didn't call it a coma then, but he wasn't really dead. John 21 says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. So we have a clue here. It was still dark. And so, like Britt said, the beginning of the day was at sunset. So early in the day would have been sunset, or, right after it's getting dark. So it's still dark. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. Luke 21 says, on the first day of the week, very early in the day. Here again, early in the day was going to be in the evening, that we consider the evening, right? The women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And here again, they prepared them. They wouldn't have prepared them on the Sabbath day. They couldn't have prepared them on the Sabbath day. They couldn't work on the Sabbath. So there had to be a day, at least one day in between the day of rest and when they went on the first day of the week. Mark 15:1 says, when the Sabbath was over, so that evening, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome.
So the Sabbath was over on Saturday. Sabbath starts Friday evening to Saturday evening, right?
Right. Now
so Saturday after the evening, if it was dark, that would not be considered the Sabbath anymore.
Right.
Okay, Saturday evening.
Right. But this was probably the day of rest, because it says Mary and the mother of James bought spices. Well, Saturday night after the sun went down on Saturday night was Sunday morning. I don't think shops opened up until daylight. So I'm thinking this had to have been maybe the Sabbath they were talking about after Passover. Then as the sun, now here's the other thing, and here's where you have to kind of go in and look, because it will say sunrise. They made their way to the tomb. Well, it can't be both dark and it can't be both light. But when you look at this verse, Mark 15:1, the word ascended can also be descended. So when you look at the verses with this word, it can mean both ascend and descend. So if it meant as the sun descended, that would mean the Sabbath was over, right? So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, because we're kind of taught that Jesus rose at sunrise. He didn't rise at sunrise. It was still dark. It was early in the day, so it was still dark. So sunrise service is something different. All right, what happened the day Yeshua died? This is where we get into Feast of First Fruits. And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. We know that this is not really taught very much in our churches, but this is when all the Old Testament saints basically rose from the grave. They went around, walking around. Jesus said, after he arose from the grave, he said, do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. So we're going to see. I don't know why I put that there, but I did. John 21 says, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. So when the priest went in and Feast of First Fruits, he had to be clean. No one could have touched him. And he offered, he offered the lamb and the first fruits. So Jesus said, he was saying here, I've got to go up to my Father. He was the lamb, the perfect lamb. And who was he taking with him? The feast of the first fruits. Who were the first fruits?
The Old
The
Testament.
Old Testament saints, yes.
Yeah.
Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it in my side. Stop doubting and believe. So here, he couldn't have anybody touch him yet because he had not ascended to his Father. He hadn't taken the first fruits to his to God in the heavenly temple, and he hadn't offered himself as the unblemished lamb. But then a week later, he came back and he said, now you can touch me, basically. 1 Corinthians 15:23 says, but now Messiah has been raised from the dead. He became the first fruits, or he was the unblemished lamb of those who are asleep. Leviticus 23:13, and you shall offer on that day when you are wave the sheaf a male lamb of the first year. So that was Yeshua, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. And then the harvest, the first fruits of the harvest was the Old Testament saints. When Yeshua came forth from the grave, he is clean and without blemish. I'm so sorry. He gathered the Old Testament saints that had risen from the grave and went into the Holy of Holies in the heavens to be the offering of first fruits. Newly harvested grain could not be eaten until the first fruits of grain had been offered on the day after the Sabbath. Of the festival of unleavened bread. So until Yeshua became the offering, there could not be another harvest, a harvest of believers in Yeshua. So he had to take the Old Testament saints into the Holy of Holies in heaven, offer himself and the New Testament, Old Testament saints, which are the first of the harvest, before a new harvest could start. So that's how he fulfilled the Feast of First Fruits. Does anybody have any questions?
So he was like the Passover lamb. The unleavened bread was in the tomb, like when you put the bread in the oven.
Right.
It was in the tomb. And then the first fruits offering when he ascended.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And in the Passover meal, he's Afi Coleman. He's the middle matzah. He's the middle matzah for those of you who do Passover.
The hidden one, right? Is it
The
hidden?
The one they take out. They take it out, they break it, they wrap it in white linen, and they hide it.
Okay. Yeah.
And then they
I
bring,
have,
yep.
so during the first fruit, is he the priest and the lamb? That's my
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah.
I don't understand why in the New Testament, I think Paul said that he was the first fruit, because the Old Testament saints are the first fruit, or is it because he was resurrected first? Because it also said he resurrected first before the others, but he wasn't. I mean, he was bringing the Old Testament saints up, so they are the first fruits, right?
So when it says he was the first fruit. You have to think of it, he was the completion of the feast of first fruits.
Oh, okay. Because he fulfilled it.
Yeah,
It's a harvest.
yeah, he was a completion of it. He harvested all the Old Testament saints. He was the lamb, and he completed the feast of first fruits.
Okay.
So
And my-
when it says he was the first fruits, it just means that he fulfilled that.
Okay. And then my second question is, what does it mean when he said, when he was on the cross, I'm going back to Passover, sorry, instead of first fruits, when he was on the cross and he said, I think he said something like, Father, have you forsaken me or something like that? What does he mean by that?
Well, God couldn't look at him, and he turned his back.
Oh, because God's too holy to see sin, and he was taking on all of our sin at that moment.
Right.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Some other people, I think they also interpret it to like part of his suffering to be alone,
Right.
like
Well,
the fullness of it.
yeah. God could have cried. I mean, he's got feelings. He's seeing all that sinfulness and his son having to bear it. And I don't know. So, a lot of stuff we're not going to really completely understand. But we do know that it got dark and there was an earthquake and the earth opened up and all the saints, Old Testament saints, rose. Of course, it wasn't kind of like the rapture, but they did rise from the grave because it says they did. So, and that was not okay. We're going to get to the place where that wasn't the dividing point of. It is kind of confusing. A lot of it's confusing, but the Old Testament saints, that when Jesus died on the cross, from that point on, people had to believe in Jesus in order to be saved. But before then, people had to believe in Jesus coming and doing what he's doing and following his commandments. So there were two different ways of salvation, before Yeshua and then after Yeshua. So the first fruits are the ones that were believers in his coming. After that, there's believers in that he has come. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Where were the first fruits? Were they in like what state were they in? Were they just waiting or?
Oh, they were in Abraham's bosom.
Paradise.
Oh,
Paradise,
wait,
and
sorry.
there's a paradise in Abraham's bosom. There's one side called paradise and one side called Sheol, Hades, and the big gulf in between them. And I just read that to my kids about the
What is
rich man
bosom? Isn't that related to a female?
bosom, chest, in his chest area.
Oh, chest. Okay.
Some verses even say his lap, like, just in his lap, in his bosom, chest area.
It's a figure of speech. I would look at it that way.
Yeah.
Which is when you hold someone close to your bosom, that means you're
Yeah.
close to him. And
Okay.
Bosom buddies.
yeah. So like in the New Testament, when they described John's relationship to Jesus, where he was the one close to the bosom of Jesus,
Yeah.
that to the chest of Jesus, it meant that they were sort of like real close and probably affectionate. It showed a real different affection as compared to the others. So I think
Close
that's
to your
more, to
heart.
me, yeah,
Your
to me,
heart's in your chest, in your bosom.
right,
But-
right.
but-
So to me, that is more a figure of speech rather than a place of position or place.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what was their spiritual state then? Were they asleep or like
Well, in the parable of Jesus, the parable of Jesus was that they were awake. They were aware
Yes.
of what was happening on earth. The parable of Lazarus, well, which I
Right.
don't consider as a parable. It's actually a sort
Right.
of like
Is-
a
Yeah, he could feel the heat.
well can you let him finish, please?
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. Well, she was piggybacking on me.
All right.
They could feel, they could think, they could see. You know, that's what I think she was trying to say. So they could observe and they could plead, like when the rich man pled with what calls Abraham to send messengers to his brothers to tell them of his predicament and that they should change their ways. And God's response was, "They have the scriptures." And so, yeah, he could see, he could think, he could feel, he could ache. You know, that's the place where, at that time, they were located.
And Mr. Glenn,
Waiting for
Waiting for the fulfillment of Jesus' death on the cross and
okay.
his act
And
of
okay. What were you saying, Miss Britt?
No, that's what he is explaining it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Elizabeth?
and Mr. Glenn, you said